Think about how we build the modern world. You find a job, you buy a piece of land, and you build a house. You put up a roof to keep out the rain, you build a kitchen to cook your food, and you settle down. Only after an entire community has settled down and secured its survival do we build the grand structures, the cathedrals, the universities, the massive monuments. For over a century, historians and archaeologists believed this was an absolute, unbreakable law of human progress. First, humans invented farming. Farming allowed us to abandon our wandering ways and settle into villages. Villages grew into cities, and cities gave us the extra time, food, and organization required to invent organized religion and build massive temples. It is a perfectly logical story. It makes intuitive sense, except it is completely wrong. Deep in the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, there is a place that turned our entire understanding of human history upside down. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a remote limestone ridge called Göbekli Tepe. To the local herdsmen, it was just a strange, belly-shaped hill. But when Schmidt looked closer, he noticed fragments of worked flint and limestone breaking through the dirt. What he uncovered beneath that soil shouldn't have existed. He found massive, T-shaped pillars carved from single blocks of limestone, arranged in giant concentric circles. Some of these pillars stand nearly 20 feet tall and weigh up to 20 tons. And they aren't blank stones. They are covered in intricate, terrifying, three-dimensional carvings of the natural world. Striking scorpions, charging boars, snarling predators, venomous spiders, and vultures hovering over headless human bodies. When the site was carbon dated, the results sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Göbekli Tepe was built roughly 11,500 years ago. To understand just how mind-boggling that is, you have to look at the timeline of human history. This temple is 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is 6,000 years older than the Great Pyramids of Giza. Written language wouldn't be invented for another 6,000 years. This place was constructed at the very end of the last ice age. The people who built it did not have metal tools, they did not have wheels, they did not have pottery to carry water, and most importantly, they did not know how to farm. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in a world before agriculture even existed. But as archaeologists excavated further, the site became even more baffling. They looked for the signs of daily human life that are always present at ancient sites. They looked for foundations of houses, for domestic trash heaps, for cooking hearths, and for a nearby water source. They found absolutely nothing. There was no water within miles of the hill. Nobody lived here. There were no houses. This was a massive, monumental sanctuary built in the middle of an absolute wilderness. Think about the sheer logistics of this. In the Ice Age, hunter-gatherers lived in tiny nomadic bands of perhaps 20 to 30 people. They moved constantly, following the migrations of wild animals and the seasonal ripening of plants. Yet, to carve a 20-ton stone out of a limestone quarry, drag it up a steep mountain ridge, and stand it upright without wheels or beasts of burden would require the coordinated labor of hundreds of people working together for months at a time. Why would people who were constantly on the move, people whose entire lives were consumed by the daily struggle to find food and survive, choose to converge on this specific hill and expend an unimaginable amount of physical energy to build a monument they didn't even live in? The answer lies in the bizarre, highly coordinated rituals that took place within these stone circles. Let's start with the food, because the evidence left behind paints a picture of gatherings on a scale never before seen in human history. Surrounding the stone enclosures, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of animal bones, wild gazelles, ancient cattle, wild boars, and deer. But these weren't the remains of casual, everyday meals. The bones were completely smashed open for their marrow and butchered in massive quantities all at once. This wasn't daily sustenance. This was the evidence of massive, prehistoric festivals. In 2012, researchers analyzing the site made an even more startling discovery. Tucked into the corners of the stone structures were giant limestone troughs, some large enough to hold up to 40 gallons of liquid. When scientists conducted chemical analyses on the gray residue inside these vessels, they found traces of calcium oxalate, a chemical compound that is produced during the mashing and fermentation of grain. Before humans ever baked a single loaf of bread, before they ever grew a single field of wheat, they were gathering by the thousands on a mountaintop to drink wild barley beer and feast on wild meat. The world's oldest temple wasn't just a place of quiet, solemn prayer. It was an ancient, ecstatic festival ground. But there was a much darker, far more unsettling side to these mountain gatherings. For years, archaeologists wondered about the human remains at the site. They didn't find any formal graves or burials. Instead, they found over 700 human bone fragments scattered loosely among the animal bones and dirt filling the enclosures. In 2017, a team of anthropologists published a groundbreaking study that finally shed light on what was happening to the people who died at Göbekli Tepe. They analyzed the skull fragments using advanced microscopy and discovered something chilling. Deep, deliberate grooves had been carved into the bone using sharp flint tools. One of the skulls had a hole explicitly drilled through the top of it. This is the earliest, most explicit evidence of a prehistoric skull cult. The patterns on the bones show that after a person died, their body was likely left exposed to the elements, allowing vultures to strip away the flesh. This exact practice is explicitly mirrored on the carvings on the stone pillars themselves, which depict headless bodies and hovering birds. Once the bones were clean, the skull was detached from the skeleton. The living would use flint knives to carve deep lines into the bone, perhaps to decorate them or perhaps to prevent the skin from sliding off if they were partially defleshed. They would pass a cord through the drilled hole at the top and hang the human skulls directly from the T-shaped stone pillars. Imagine standing inside one of these dark, roofless stone enclosures 11,000 years ago. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and fermenting wild beer. Sparks from a massive central fire fly up into the pitch-black night sky. Around you, hundreds of people are chanting and drinking, and staring down at the crowd from the towering stone pillars suspended by ropes are the carved, stylized skulls of their ancestors, swaying in the mountain breeze. This realization completely flips the traditional narrative of human history on its head. For centuries, mainstream science argued that agriculture was the catalyst for human civilization. We assumed that farming forced us to settle down, and once we lived in dense communities, we created religion and monuments to maintain social order and cooperation. Göbekli Tepe proves the exact opposite is true. It wasn't farming that came first. It was the urge to worship, the desire to gather, and the elaborate rituals surrounding the dead that forced humans to cooperate on a massive scale for the very first time. To feed the hundreds of workers building the temple, and to sustain the thousands of people traveling to these massive festivals, the local hunter-gatherers had to find a more reliable source of food than just foraging wild patches of grass. They began to intensively gather wild wheat, protecting it, managing it, and eventually domesticating it. Geneticists have actually traced the origin of all modern domesticated Eimer wheat back to a single mountain ridge just 20 miles away from Göbekli Tepe. The birth of agriculture, the invention of farming, and the subsequent rise of cities wasn't an economic choice made by practical hunters. It was a cultural and religious necessity driven by the demands of a temple. Religion didn't appear after civilization. Religion built civilization. But perhaps the most bizarre ritual associated with Göbekli Tepe is how its story ended. After using these massive stone enclosures for centuries, the builders didn't just walk away and let the elements reclaim them. They buried them. Every few generations, the people would take an entire, functioning stone circle, and they would intentionally fill it from top to bottom with hundreds of tons of dirt, gravel, and animal bones. They completely erased it from the landscape, hiding it from view, only to build a brand new, slightly smaller stone circle right next to it or directly on top of the old one. They repeated this cycle of building, using, and burying for over 1,500 years. Around 8000 BCE, they buried the entire complex one final time, smoothing over the top of the mound and walked away into the landscape forever. They created a perfect, deliberate time capsule.
We often view our modern world as a series of logical steps driven by technology and survival. We think of our ancestors as primitive versions of ourselves, focused entirely on the basic mechanics of staying alive. But if you strip away the millennia and look back to the very dawn of human civilization, you find something entirely different. You find that we are a species driven by imagination, by myth, and by the need to connect with something larger than ourselves. We didn't build temples because we became civilized so that we could build temples.